Is being imperfect the same as being inadequate? When our vulnerabilities become targets for cruelty, shame, and self-blame, we begin to disconnect from one another. Learn how to reclaim yourself. Next on Living Smart. Hello, I'm Patricia Gras. Welcome to Living Smart, the show designed to help you get the most out of life. On today's show, shame researcher and lecturer Dr. Brene Brown helps us understand shame and its influence in our lives. Find out why this emotion may be holding you back in the most important areas of your life.
Shame is the loud voice that screams at me within the recesses of my mind. You are worthless and bad, chewing up my positive thoughts, devouring my self-esteem.
It is the last day of class for these students in Dr. Brene Brown's Shame and Empathy class. Each student shares their experience with shame through their artwork.
I looked at my life and saw how a lot of my life has been behind a mask, covering some of that pain from shame that I've experienced throughout my life.
From Dr. Brown's perspective, men are born in regards to shame in a box. Inside the box, we all have to contain ourselves. Of course, it's myself in the corner, broken and shattered, with the finger pointing, with many different things in my life that have been shaming to me.
Immediately I thought, it's a cross we all bear. Whether or not we like it, we walk around with this bound to an invisible cross of shame.
For Joy Drake, shame, which often thrives in silence, also has a special sound.
One of the things that I think happens when we do art or we use creative outlets to find out what shame means for us is that we really get in touch with how it feels for us. We need to know what it feels like.
2 years ago,
like,
shame
sounds
researcher
like
and
for us, so
lecturer
that
Dr.
when we're in
Brene
it,
Brown began teaching a
is really
shame
the
and
most
empathy
important
class
aspect
to
of
her
our work,
social
which is
work
do no
graduate
harm.
students at the University of
also
Houston
need to help
based
them.
on her research.
Shame is one of the primary reasons that people seek help. Yet they come to get help and we don't talk about it. I mean, it's the core issue.
Reminded by symbols of courage by her life mentors, Dr. Brown decided to write a book on women and shame. Her book hit a nerve, and she became a trailblazer on the subject, lecturing around the country about a topic no one seemed to want to talk about.
Women most often experience shame as a web. That's the metaphor I use for women. A very conflicting and competing expectations about who we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to look, how we're supposed to act, have a career, be successful, but never at the expense of your family.
It wasn't until a man challenged her after a lecture she gave on women and shame that she began to study men.
And I said, I don't study men. And he said, well, that's convenient. He said, because I've listened to everything you said during your lecture, and I think it's all true and important. But, we try to be vulnerable and we try to keep it real and we speak out and share our fear and our story. And he said, then we get the emotional shit beat out of us. So the difference between shame and guilt is the difference between...
Today, Dr. Brown wants a national conversation on shame for everyone, especially the most vulnerable groups, such as these former inmates.
Our women are between the ages of 35 and 60, and so many of them have been in prison many times. And they got into a cycle of addiction, and their behaviors around addiction were things that societally are not very acceptable. So what we noticed was the women were trapped in a cycle of shame. How real is this to you? Does this resonate with you?
Twyla Ross is the director of Bridget's Home, which works with women recently released from prison to help them get on with life. For the next 9 weeks, these women will watch Dr. Brown's curriculum on shame and resilience.
Shame is being rejected. Shame is when you can't do it all.
One of the things that I think Dr. Brown does brilliantly is she humanizes shame. And she puts it on a common ground, which it is. And she talks about the commonality of all of us having that feeling, which opens the door even by the fact that she can say the word.
After they watch the film, the women discuss it.
I have tons of shame because I have a skin condition, but that in turn made me promiscuous, rowdy, a drunk, an addict, and you have to learn about the behaviors and how to not do that because it doesn't make you okay.
For most of these women and their mentors, addiction and abuse was the greatest source of shame and pain.
I received a 15-year sentence for heroin. Well, actually, it was burglary of a habitat was my charge. And for so many years, I carried that baggage, that I was just a shameful person. My core issue, of course, like a lot of women, were connected to sexual abuse. So through this program, I've worked through that.
I began using drugs at a very young age, and over the years, I kept on using it, and I became addicted. In my addiction, I committed some crimes. And I was in and out of prison for 20 years. Well, shame played a humongous role in my life during my addiction because it's what kept me bound.
Both these women have been out of prison and sober now for over 2 years.
A simple definition.
For Dr. Brown, defining shame and guilt moves the process of healing along.
Really a definition, right? All I had to say is guilt, I did something bad. Shame, I am bad. I think the most powerful representation of that is when I talked about mistakes, right? How many of you could apologize for making a mistake? How many of you would apologize for being a mistake?
Dr. Brown wants her students to understand that to counsel others, they too must confront and embrace their own shame in order to understand the destructive emotion in their clients.
There's something incredibly universal about it. And what's universal about it is our fear of inadequacy, our fear of not being good enough, the tremendous, very human fear of not being lovable, that there's something you will know or find out or think about me that makes me really unworthy of connection. I believe, personally and professionally, that connection, human connection, is what gives purpose and meaning to our lives.
Shame may still exist in my world and visit me often, but I now have the power to choose whether it can stay for long. I am no longer silent nor alone. Thanks.
Thank you for being with us, Dr. Brown.
I'm so glad to be here.
Great to have you. Why is it that you refer to shame as the master emotion? Can you explain that?
I think shame is probably the most primitive human emotion that we experience. If you look how we're built for connection with each other, neurobiologically hardwired to be in connection. And so one helpful way to think about shame is the fear of disconnection. And so if connection is the primary reason we're here, if that gives purpose and meaning to our lives, the fear that something about who we are, what we've done or failed to do, the idea that that could threaten connection really underlies almost everything.
It's very powerful. What triggered you to write about shame in the first place?
You know, I kind of got hijacked by the topic. I didn't intend to be a shame, and especially because I'm a shame, empathy, and vulnerability researcher, and so people are usually like, "Oh God, that's horrible! What a terrible job!"
Cheer up!
Yeah, right, exactly. I really was interested in studying human connection, and so about 10 years ago, as a doctoral student, I started looking at human connection. Well, about 6 months into my research, I bumped into this thing that it would unravel connection, and it would destroy connection, and I couldn't figure out what the name of it was. And then I thought, is this shame? And I started looking at it in the literature, and I thought, God, for such a powerful emotion, there's not very much work on it. I said, let me spend 6 months just looking at shame and what it is, because I couldn't find a definition that spoke to me in a way that fit who I was in my life, professionally or personally. And so then, 9 years later.
And what was that definition? I know it's a long definition, but
it's
simply.
I think, here's what I think is hard. I think we have heady academic definitions for shame. But here's the thing. Shame is not something to be known by our head. Shame is a full body, heart emotion.
Everything.
And so everything made sense to me academically, but in terms of trying to juggle my life as a mom and an academic and a researcher, and all the complicated things that I am, nothing spoke to my heart. And so I wanted to go out and build a definition based on the stories I heard from people. I'm a qualitative researcher, so I do long interviews. And so about 2 or 3 years into the interviewing, I came up with the definition that shame is this intensely painful feeling or belief that we are flawed and somehow inadequate and unworthy of connection.
Interesting, okay.
And so that made sense to me.
Right. Has our culture changed with regards to shame?
Yeah, I think it has. I think that one thing that stayed constant is we've always been afraid to talk about shame. What I'll tell people is, here are the 3 things you need to know about shame. We all have it. We're all terrified to talk about it. And the less we have it, the less we talk about it, the more we have it. But our culture, I think what happens is because we won't have real honest conversations about it, yet we're so hungry to understand it, we've turned it into entertainment. We've turned it's really become this kind of underground perverse thing. Reality television, for example. It's very difficult for people to have an honest conversation about shame and fear of inadequacy, but yet we'll all sit down at 8 o'clock and turn on to television shows where people are being ridiculed and humiliated in front, for entertainment. So in a way, Miriam, there's a lot of shame in media. There's a lot of shame in entertainment. It's almost kind of become blood sport. But the thing that hasn't changed is we're still not having honest conversations about it. And it's more difficult today because I think today, more so than any other time in our history, perfectionism has been commodified. So here you've got this culture that packages and sells perfectionism.
Right. Everybody's skinny and thin.
And beautiful, and their houses are perfect, and their marriages are perfect, and their partnerships are perfect, and work is great. And
the reality is
that
not.
Life is hard.
Right.
And so now for the first time, you've got media and advertising really commodifying perfection and no place for people to talk about it.
Right. Well, and that led to my next question. What is the relationship between shame and perfectionism?
There's a tremendous relationship because I think perfectionism is this idea that if I'm perfect or do it perfectly, I will be accepted and loved.
Right. And that doesn't happen.
Right. And so what happens is if you struggle with perfectionism, look at the areas in your life where you struggle with perfectionism. And what I can tell you is those are probably the areas where you deal with a fear of shame. So if it's very important to you that your family look a certain way and that your marriage look a certain way, that you probably have some real deep shame issues around, I'm afraid if people see what's really happening, I won't be worthy of connection and acceptance.
You say that shame leads to disconnection. So how do we reconnect? Let's say we realize, hey, I've dealt with this emotion and I want to reconnect. How do I do that?
It's funny because there's an irony. There's a lot of ironies, I guess, about shame, and one of the ironies is shame fills us with this fear of disconnection, but it is our imperfection that connects us to each other. It is the fact that our shared humanity is imperfect, and so I think if we can find the courage to talk about our lives honestly and our struggles, I think not only does that free us, it gives other people the freedom to be more authentic and real as well.
Right.
I don't think connection is possible without authenticity.
And it's hard to be authentic. There's a price for it.
There's a price for it.
Very. Now, you said that there are 4 things that humans have in common. What are those things with regards to shame?
Well, one of the things that was really powerful, I think, about my work is I have interviewed over 600 men and women now across the country about shame. And across the interviews, men and women with high levels of resilience to shame share 4 things in common. The first is they physically recognize when they're in shame and they know what triggered it. So let's say something happens at work, I make a mistake or something happens, and that warm wash comes over me. That feeling, yes, yeah. We all know it. If I can physically say, oh my God, no, this is shame, I'm in shame,
it's very helpful because we are not fit for human consumption when we're in shame. Okay. We need to pull away and get regrounded, take some deep breaths, and figure out how to respond. One of the things that makes shame worse is normally when we're in it, we act out. For example, the mother that I interviewed, she fills her car up. She goes into the gas station. She goes to pay. Her credit card's declined. The man shames her in front of the other patrons, makes her leave her wedding band and her wallet and leave with just an ATM card. So she's filled with shame. She gets in the car. She slams the door. When she slams the door, it wakes up her 3-year-old toddler who's in the back seat, who starts screaming. What happens next? She starts screaming back, "Shut up, shut up." Right. So now she's in the shame of having this credit card declined, being belittled in front of people, and now having to deal with the struggle of, I'm a horrible mom and why am I taking this out of my child? So men and women with high levels of resilience recognize physically when they're in shame and what triggered it. Okay. Then they practice critical awareness. How realistic are the expectations and messages that we put on ourselves or that others put on us that tell us who we're supposed to be? The third thing is men and women with high levels of resilience reach out. We've got to share our story.
So they talk about it.
They talk about it. We breathe through it, we recognize we're in it, and then we call and say, "Hey, Patricia, it's me. You're not going to believe what happened. Can you listen? It's hard." And then we speak shame. I try to explain to people the importance of using the word shame. And this is not just lay people. This is mental health professionals. Right. We've got to use the word. It's different. If I were to call you and say, "Oh, Patricia, it's Brene, I'm so embarrassed," that would mean one thing, right? But if I were to call you and say, "Patricia, it's Brene, and I'm really struggling with some shame," that's different.
Yeah, it's a different conversation.
Right. Shame cannot hold on when we name it.
Right.
So it's not just, an academic pet peeve. I want everybody to get the semantics correct. Men and women with high levels of shame resilience use the word and talk about the emotion.
How do we learn the attributes of empathy? I mean, if somebody calls you and wants to start having a conversation about shame, you have to have empathy, I think.
It's key. You're exactly right, because what I found in my research is the opposite of experiencing shame is experiencing empathy. Mm-hmm. Shame cannot survive empathy. I think empathy is tough. I think we have some natural tendencies to be empathic. We care for our fellow humans, but we kind of unlearn empathy as a way to survive almost. Right. And so being empathic is about connecting with your experience. Maybe if you called me and you told me, "Man, something really shaming happened, Brene, and here's what it is." Maybe I've never had that experience. But what I tell people is, I know grief. I know rage. I know shame. I know fear. If I can dig deep and try to connect to what it is that you're feeling and express that back, not by saying, "Oh, I know exactly what you're going through," because none of us ever know that, but I know what it feels like to be backed into a corner in front of colleagues at work. So you're not alone. Empathy is hugely important, and just an added plus, it's highly correlated with everything from leadership skills, family functioning, good parenting. It's just the essential emotion, I think.
Now, shame, though, I would think that it's not always a negative emotion to have. For example, when you're growing up and somebody says, "Shame on you," I mean, you did something really wrong.
Right.
Let's take a serious offense like pedophiles or criminals or assassins. Yeah. Isn't it good for them to feel some shame?
No.
Okay, tell me about that, because some people think, well, some people need to be ashamed.
Yeah, I get that.
Right?
Yeah, because I'm with the people that want them to feel bad.
Right,
but,
right.
Here's what we know. That the people that you're talking about are the shame in their lives probably is at the root cause of those behaviors. Mm-hmm. Shame is far more likely to cause destructive behaviors than it is to cure it. What we know is that shame is highly correlated with addiction, violence, aggression, bullying. It's not helpful to be ashamed for this reason, and I think this is really a core thing that we need to get our heads and hearts around as a culture. Shame corrodes the part of us that believes we can change. So to shame someone into changing is like saying to them, "You are horrible and worthless and you're not capable of change. Get better."
Mm-hmm. Right.
Now, guilt on the other hand,
how are you going to get better, right?
Guilt, big fan of guilt. Guilt is...
Yeah, and you explain a little bit the difference between guilt and shame, but can you explain again?
Yeah, this is hugely important. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad.
Right, and there's a difference.
There's a difference
Huge
between
difference.
focusing on self and focusing on behavior. Guilt is when you hold something you've done or failed to do up against who you want to be, and it doesn't feel good. But what we know is when people make amends or change behaviors or apologize authentically, guilt is the motivator for that. We rarely see shame.
Interesting.
Right.
So people should feel guilty as opposed to feel ashamed, is what you're saying, if they did something wrong.
Absolutely.
Because there's a difference between the person and the action.
Absolutely.
You like to call yourself more a vulnerability researcher than a shame researcher. Why is that? What does vulnerability have to do with all of this?
It's interesting. Yet another term that no one likes. I'm like, my husband. Yeah, my husband's always like, "Can't you find like a something researcher that's like a good thing?" I'm working on it. I think we talked about connection,
right?
And I think if you think of connection as the thing that gives purpose and meaning to life, on one end you have shame, and on the other end you have empathy. I think what moves us between these is vulnerability.
Interesting. Okay.
Vulnerability is about how do we sit with uncertainty? How do we sit with fear? I tell people in the workshops and the lectures I do, if you can figure out who you are when you're backed into vulnerability, it's one of the greatest gifts you can give yourself and the people who love you.
Why?
Well, I'll use myself as an example. A lot of my work this last year personally has been about who am I when I feel vulnerable? And one of the things that I realized is that I have a tendency to armor up when I'm vulnerable. I have a tendency to get very academic, make sure all my initials behind my name are all ratcheted up, and that's how I protect myself. But that moves me towards disconnection. So who do you become? Do you disappear? Do you lash out? Do you armor up? Do you people please? Who do you become when you feel vulnerable? And it's a really powerful thing to know about yourself, and also is absolutely instrumental to shame resilience.
Okay. Now, how does self-esteem play into shame?
It's interesting because I thought when I first started this research that there would be a very strong correlation between self-esteem and shame, but there's not. Self-esteem is a cognitive function. When I say, Patricia, what's your self-esteem? What you're going to do is you're going to
rate 1 to 10.
Right. Give me a number. My quantitative friends would love that. What you're going to do is you're going to go into a thinking process. Who am I? What are my strengths? What are my limitations? Who am I in relationship to my goals? You're going to think about it, and then you're going to come up with this answer that's kind of your self-concept. Shame is not a thinking emotion. It is a feeling emotion. We think self-esteem, we feel shame. So no matter what your self-esteem is, you are vulnerable to shame.
How do you recognize shame within you? You're saying it's a feeling, but
it's interesting because I think it's not too hard. I ask people some basic questions. When you're in shame, what are your physical symptoms? Like, what do you feel when you're in shame? For me, time slows down. My mouth gets dry. I get kind of tunnel vision. I'm like a human barometer. Like I start getting red right here and just go all the way up. We have physical symptoms of shame because when we experience shame, we move from this prefrontal cortex where we think and rationalize and organize into like lizard brain, the most primitive part of the brain, the limbic system, fight, flight, and freeze. And so for most of us, we seize up. So if you can recognize what are your physical symptoms of shame, then what you can do is say, oh God, I recognize this. I interviewed one woman who said, oh, she was so helpful for me. She said whenever something shaming happened to her, she would go like this, pain, 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 pain. And I thought, ooh, she's crazy, But then about a month after I interviewed her, something shaming happened for me. And I was like, I was desperate. I was like, pain, 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 pain. I was like, oh, this is helpful. Pain, 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 pain. And neurobiologically, it makes total sense because what you're doing is when we go into shame and that limbic system is activated, the prefrontal cortex where we do our smart thinking comes offline. Saying pain, 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 pain gets this back online so we can make smart, authentic choices about how to respond to what happened.
Okay. How do you heal it?
How do you heal it? I think it's those elements of shame resilience. I think it is understanding it, learning the differences between shame and guilt. It's practicing recognizing it. It's practicing critical awareness. You know, critical awareness is, I get a lot of questions. What do you mean critical awareness? What I mean is a lot of women wake up in the morning, we stand in front of the mirror and we go, old, fat, tired. You know, critical awareness is being able to say, you know what, and there's a $60 billion industry depending on that, but not today.
That's right. Now, how do you know you're living smart?
How do I know I live? You know, when I can be still and comfortable at the same time, I know I'm living smart.
What do you mean?
I think we all stay really busy because we have hectic lives, but I think being really busy serves us, perfecting and planning, because I think it keeps us from having to feel. And so I know I'm living smart when I'm comfortable being still.
Right, and you're in silence. So you
and
can
I'm in
listen to
silence, yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate
It was fun.
And to learn more about this topic, go to our website. There you'll also find a complete resource list. You can also email us or call us with your comments at 713-743-8513. And that's our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to live smart. I'm Patricia Gras. Have a healthy and wonderful week.
For a transcript of this program, send $6.95 to the address on your screen. Please include the name of the guest.